Okay, welcome back. For this video, we will focus on chapter number 9, the endocrine system. Now, along with the nervous system, the endocrine system is a major communication system within the body. It controls almost everything that you do. And its main function is to maintain what's called homeostasis, a stable internal environment. That's what your body is always striving for, to be as stable as possible. Now, this is done through the actions of a substance called a hormone. Now, here's the formal definition for hormones. These are chemical messengers that are secreted into the blood by an endocrine gland. And next, I will cover the difference between endocrine and exocrine. People tend to get this confused quite often. An endocrine gland is a structure that will secrete a substance into the internal environment, such as into the blood. The prefix endo means internal or inside. The opposite of that would be an exocrine gland. Exocrine gland would be a substance that will be secreted into the external environment. For example, sweat, milk from a nursing mother. That's all going outside of the body through a duct to the external environment. So exo means exit or outside. Endo means inside. Anything that's endocrine goes internally into the internal environment, such as blood. And exocrine goes to the external environment through a duct. All right, here's a generic image of the endocrine organs. You have the hypothalamus and the pituitary up here, which we'll talk about quite a lot about here in a second. Pineal gland back here. You have the parathyroids and thyroid, thymus, liver, the kidneys. On top of that, the adrenals, pancreas. And for female, of course, the ovaries, and for males, the testes. Probably the biggest player in the endocrine system is the pituitary gland. And it's so important, it's often called the master gland because it controls so many hormones. And even though it plays such a major role in the endocrine system, the pituitary is controlled by a section of the brain called the hypothalamus. About half of the pituitary gland is really just an extension of the hypothalamus. If you see it here, it actually grows into the back part of the pituitary gland, the posterior lobe. So there are two different sections which we'll talk about here next. But the hypothalamus is what controls all the pituitary gland. Alright, the pituitary has two very distinct, very different regions, the anterior lobe and posterior lobe. Remember what those terms mean. Anterior is toward the front, and posterior is toward the back. So going back to this image here, anterior lobe here, and then the posterior lobe here, which is just an extension of the hypothalamus. Now these are different in many, many ways, including what kind of tissue they're made up of, and what kind of hormones they secrete. Okay. And they also will look differently when they are stained on the slide because they have two different types of tissue. The anterior lobe will stain much darker because it has more vascular tissue. The posterior lobe, because it has more nervous tissue, tends to stain a little bit lighter. And it doesn't matter what color that you choose. This could easily be shades of green or blue or purple or yellow. The anterior lobe will always stain darker because it has more vascular tissue. Alright, next we'll talk about various organs of the endocrine system and what hormones they produce. So don't be surprised if you're asked to match the hormones to the structure that it comes from. The first one we'll talk about is the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And this is where to come up on a test if you just label the answer as, or if you just put the answer as pituitary gland, it's going to be marked wrong. You have to put either anterior or posterior because they are two separate structures. See, the first one, growth hormone, also labeled as GH. This will stimulate cells to get larger, to rapidly divide. This is how you get from the newborn baby size to an adult size. This is how you get bigger, which kind of the name of the hormone tells you what it's doing. It's growth hormone. And also for a lot of these, you'll see the abbreviation listed after its name. It's perfectly fine to use either the abbreviation or the full name. They are interchangeable. Next one, prolactin. This will promote milk production in women who are pregnant. To lactate means to produce milk, so prolactin. It promotes the production of milk. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. It's like the name kind of implies, it will stimulate hormones of the thyroid gland. And we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes. All right, the next one, ACTH, full name, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This will control secretions of hormones of a certain portion of the adrenal gland called the adrenal cortex. And we'll talk about that also here in a few minutes. So for something like this, much easier just to put ACTH as opposed to writing out the full name every single time. Next one, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. It will stimulate the growth of follicles in ovaries. This will also secrete or stimulate the secretion of estrogen, the production of sperm cells in males. And the last one on here, the LH, luteinizing hormone. This is what causes a woman to ovulate each month. This causes the release of the egg cell during ovulation. Alright, those first 6 were a part of the anterior pituitary. There are only 2 that come from the posterior pituitary. The first one, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. This is what will cause the kidneys to retain water and reduce urine formation. So if you don't want to pee, you'll take an ADH. If you are wanting to pee, you will be given a diuretic. So an antidiuretic makes you pee less. And the second one and last one for the posterior pituitary, OT, oxytocin. This is what will help stimulate the muscles in the uterus to contract during childbirth. For women who have had their labor induced, they are most likely given a form of this called tocin. It works the same way, but it's a synthetic form of OT. It will stimulate the muscles in the uterus to contract and help pushing baby down. Our next organ we'll move to is the thyroid gland. This is found just below your voice box and in front of the trachea, just in front part of your throat. It's made up of 2 bands of tissue, or 2 lobes of tissue, and it's connected by a thin band, and that thin band is called an isthmus. And when you look at it, kind of laid out, it looks almost like a butterfly shape. And this gland is made up of structures called follicles. Okay, here's an image of where this would be. This picture is a male. That would be the Adam's apple here. That thyroid cartilage here, just below that, is the thyroid gland. So there's a front view and a back view. We'll talk about these here in a few minutes. But that's one lobe, that's another lobe. So the isthmus is that band of tissue right here in the middle. Okay, here are examples of how these follicles will look. Now, this one whole section here, that is one follicle. So that's one follicle here, that's one follicle here, that's almost all of one follicle here, and made up of those simple cuboidal shaped cells. And we'll talk about follicles more here in a second. Some other views of follicles. There's a full one here, another full one here, and in between these follicles there are other types of cells called parafollicular cells or C cells. Either term is fine. All right, next we'll talk about the hormones produced by the thyroid gland. The first one, thyroxine. Its full name is T4, or also called tetroiodothyramine. It's just more convenient is to say T4. This will help regulate metabolism, accelerate growth and development, and also helps to control metabolic rate and appetite. Something very similar to T4 is T3, triiodothyronine. It has the same functions as T4, but T3 is much, much stronger. Now usually these are referenced collectively as just a thyroid hormone, even though they are 2 separate chemically and different structures. That's why I have them divided up as T4 and T3. So same functions, help control appetite and metabolism and accelerate growth, but T3 is much, much stronger. If someone has a thyroid that's underproducing, if you have hypothyroidism, it's going to be very, very difficult to lose weight. You may have the perfect diet, you may exercise all the time, but if these hormones aren't working, it's going to be hard to break down the food that you're eating and metabolize it correctly. Really, really difficult to lose weight if you have a underproducing thyroid gland. Now both T3 and T4 are produced by the follicles. This will not be true of the next hormone we'll talk about. Next one, calcitonin. This will help regulate the levels of calcium in the blood. Now these are secreted by those extrafollicular cells, or C cells. And they're secreted when calcium in the blood gets too high. So the overall effect of calcitonin is to lower blood calcium. We can think about it, L for lower, L in calcitonin here. Alright, next talk about the parathyroid gland. These are the 4 small structures found on the back side of the thyroid. These 4 masses right here, those are the parathyroid glands, all 4 of those. Alright, they produce a hormone called PTH, parathyroid hormone. So it should be easy to match that hormone with that structure. A parathyroid hormone comes from the parathyroid glands. Now this is secreted when blood calcium levels are too low. So its overall effect is to raise blood calcium. So calcitonin and PTH have exactly opposite effects. Calcitonin will lower blood calcium, PTH will raise blood calcium. And here's a nice graphic that has all that kind of put together. This is where you want your blood calcium level, a nice stable level value here. If it gets too high, that will cause the thyroid gland to release calcitonin, which will lower it back down to normal. If it gets too low, the parathyroids, these four in yellow, will kick in and secrete PTH, and that will raise blood calcium back to normal levels. This is an ongoing issue. You don't want blood calcium to get too high or too low. You want to keep it as stable as you can. This is how the parathyroids look. It's really hard to tell any discernible pattern in here. It's just a jumbled mess of cells. And there are other cells that we won't talk about. The chief cells or the oxyphil cells. They have their own individual functions, but we won't get into those. Alright, the next structure we'll talk about, the adrenal glands. These are the pyramid-shaped glands that sit just on top of the kidneys. They have two separate regions, the medulla and the cortex. Each region is very different from the other. They produce different types of hormones, and they're made up of different types of tissue. So just like with the pituitary, you have to be specific when you're giving an answer. You can't just say the adrenal glands. I will need the adrenal cortex or adrenal medulla. Now these terms, medulla and cortex, are general biological terms. Cortex always means the outside of a structure, or more toward the outside, and medulla means more toward the middle. So M for medulla, M for middle. So that tells you where these regions are found. Alright, here's a nice picture of all of this together. Here are the kidneys here. The adrenals would be the entire structure on top. This whole thing here. And further dividing it, this light blue color would be the cortex, more on the outside, and this light pink color in the middle, the adrenal medulla. Alright, first we'll talk about the hormones of the adrenal medulla, so the ones from the middle. These medullary cells secrete two very closely related hormones. They're very closely related, but they are not identical. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. And although these are incredibly similar, there are some effects of these that are different. So they're not the same thing. So adrenaline and noradrenaline are not the same. And the effects of these hormones will cause increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, decreased digestion, among other things. Whenever you have a scare, let's say you almost get in a car wreck, and even though that event has passed, you still feel kind of tingling, you still feel your heart racing, you're still kind of breathing heavy. That's because of the adrenaline or the epinephrine. Now, until that hormone gets broken down and dissipates, that's why you feel the way that you do. It's because of epinephrine. It's also the same reason why when you have a fright, or whenever you have a scare like that, digestion function will stop, kidney function will stop, because it's not terribly important at that second. It also goes to control of the muscles of the bladder. So if you have a semi-full bladder of urine and you have a scare like that, this is why you may pee on yourself, because those control of those muscles are ignored at that point to focus on your heart rate and your breathing rate and being able to focus on your emergency situation. All right, this is how closely related these two are. They're all based on the neurotransmitter dopamine. This is how this looks. So the only difference between dopamine and norepinephrine is the addition of this right here. It's not on this one, but it is on this one, that hydroxide group. The only difference between this and epinephrine is the addition of this methyl group here. Not on that one, but it is on that one. So they are very closely related, but not identical. All right, next we'll talk about the hormones of the adrenal cortex. Now these are critical for life, and the two most important of these are aldosterone and cortisol. Aldosterone will help conserve sodium ions and help to excrete potassium ions. This helps control blood pressure. It also goes back to regulating the function of the neurons. Remember, you need sodium and you need potassium for those to work properly. And what helps to control how much aldosterone is released is a hormone from the kidney called renin. All right, cortisol, also called the stress hormone. We'll talk about why that is in a second. Now, this will influence glucose and proteins and fats by a whole variety of reasons. I'll talk about these briefly. First, it will inhibit protein synthesis to increase concentration of amino acids. Remember, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So to block proteins being made, you have more access to individual amino acids. The liver can turn those amino acids into energy, into glucose. For number 2, it will promote the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue, therefore decreasing the need for glucose as an energy source. It's basically releasing fatty acids from fat cells and using that as a source of energy and not relying so much on the glucose that's already stored in your body. And number 3, stimulates the liver to synthesize glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, which will increase blood glucose levels. And bottom line for all 3 of these steps, you are creating more energy sources for your body to use. So like for the first one, you are turning amino acids into a source of energy. You're turning those into glucose. You're turning fatty acids into glucose, which will give you a source of energy. You're turning non-carbohydrate resources into glucose, decreasing your need for blood glucose that's already there. So the whole point of all of this, the whole point of all cortisol, is to give you a very quick supply of energy right away, without using the normal fuel that your body normally uses. And it's called the stress hormone because whenever you're in a situation of stress, the more energy that you have, the better your body can deal with it. So, and everyone deals with stress. That's not what I'm talking about, because you need stress in your life. But too much stress can kill you. That saying is true. Stress can kill you. Having too much cortisol in your body for too long a time can start to break down blood vessels. Can start to break down tissue. So a little bit of stress is fine. Too much stress can wear your body down. Can lower your immune response to being sick. So cortisol is incredibly needed, incredibly effective in short spurts of time. It's not something you want to just abuse constantly. Here is an image of a tissue of the adrenal glands, the top part, the outermost part, the cortex, and then medulla more toward the middle. Again, 2 different types of tissue. They look different, and they make 2 different types of hormones. All right, next, move on to the pancreas. This is found just behind, just posterior to the stomach, and has both an endocrine and exocrine function. And for this chapter, we'll focus on the endocrine functions. When we get to the digestive system, we'll talk about the exocrine functions. Now, these sections that are endocrine in the pancreas are grouped in small groups of cells called pancreatic islets, or also called the islets of Langerhans. That's the full name. And these islets have 3 types of cells that will secrete something: alpha, beta, and delta. All right, here's an image. Of course, here's the liver, here's the gallbladder, here's the first part, small intestine. The part that's kind of grayed out here is the stomach, here, all the way up here. So just behind the stomach would be the pancreas. Here's how one islet looks. If you were to look at this on a tissue slide, it stains a little bit lighter than the tissue around it. So in here is where you'll find the alpha, beta, and delta cells. Okay, next we'll talk about hormones of the pancreas and what cells they're secreted from. The first one, glucagon. This will stimulate the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. Glycogen is a stored form of glucose. This also will cause the liver to convert other non-carbohydrate sources into glucose. And this is secreted by the alpha cells. So the whole point of glucagon is to raise blood sugar. Of course, the opposite of that will be insulin. This will help your body cells to take in glucose and therefore lower the levels of blood sugar. So these are secreted by the beta cells. So insulin lowers blood sugar, glucagon raises blood sugar. And the third type, the delta cells, we won't really mention it here, but I'll just kind of mention it in passing. It secretes a hormone that will help control glucagon and insulin, because you don't want one to be made too much or too little compared to the other. You want this to be as balanced as possible. Briefly mention some other endocrine glands. Pineal gland. This is found near the thalamus in the brain. it secretes melatonin, which causes the feeling of sleepiness. This is why you feel tired whenever it's raining or whenever it's overcast. Your body starts to think that it's nighttime, so that's why it's getting you ready to take a nap or getting you ready to go to bed. So that's why you feel that way when it's raining. It's a real physiological reason why you feel like that. Next one, thymus. This will secrete a hormone called thymosins. This will play a role with immunity and how immune cells mature. It starts off quite large when you're a newborn, relative to overall body size. But after you hit middle age, it will start to shrink and shrink and shrink to the point where it's going to be all completely gone and replaced by fat cells. And last two, testes, of course only found in males, will produce testosterone, and ovaries, found in females, will produce estrogen and progesterone. And we'll talk more about both of these hormones later in the course. That brings us to the end of Chapter 9. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.